I'm going to introduce today's speaker before we start today's sessions. So today we are happy to welcome Dr. Vivek Mishra, who is a research fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi, and Deputy Director, Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies, Bhubaneswar. He is also an assistant professor on leave in international relations at the Netaji Institute for Asian Studies, Kolkata. He has been 2019 South Asian Voices Visiting Fellow at Stimson Center, Washington, D.C., and a Fulbright Visiting Scholar at the Institute of War and Peace, School of International Public Affairs, Columbia University. Vivek has done his PhD in International Relations from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Vivek's area of research mostly concerned about American and Chinese security role in the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific regions, including US defense relations and Indian defense sector. So apart from such an exciting profile, Vivek also has amazing editorial and research profile. So Dr. Mishra is also assistant editor with the Indian Foreign Affairs Journal run by the Association of Indian Diplomats, besides contributing editor in the Geopolitical magazine, an online platform focusing on international relations in South Asia. He has also worked as a research associate with Indian Research and Advisory, a New Delhi-based think tank consulting on Indian defense sector and internal security. Previously, Mr. Mishra was a research fellow with Center for Joint Welfare Studies, Integrated Defense Staff, Ministry of Defense. So before he starts, I just want to set the tone for today's discussions. I request all of you kindly to mute your audio and your video. And for your question, we will give 10 to 15 minutes for question and answer. You can post your question in the chat boxes, which I will communicate with the speaker. So let's start before setting the tone. So today we have the topic US in post-pandemic South Asia, regional interest and great power role. So South Asia is a very interesting and very dynamic region because it hosts around 1.9 billion populations of the world. And during the pandemic time, we can see renewed interest of two superpowers, specifically the United States and China. And especially the China's interest in this region is really worrisome. And especially the China's activities in the Indian Ocean region and also in the Himalayan border is really worrisome for our people living in the South Asian region. And especially the outbreak of the pandemic in this region has really changed the lifestyle and the life of people. And apart from that, we can see a new regional and strategic dynamics which is coming out in this region, especially through the outlook of United States and China. So without much delay, I'd like to request Dr. Vivek Mishra to continue his presentations. Thank you so much. Vivek, you can start now.
Thank you, Kaustav, for a generous introduction and this opportunity. Thank you also to Royal Global University for having me here. I think it's really a privilege to be interacting with so many students. I can see the list. And I'm happy to see Commodore Anil Jai Singh here, who I had the privilege of meeting a few days ago. Thank you, sir. So I'll just, start by saying that what I thought I'll do today is to speak for about 20-25 minutes and then make it more interactive. As I understand, it's a university, and you cannot have more curious minds than in a university. So let me start with a brief history of US in South Asia, which will give you a context in terms of how the US is, where US is coming from, and what are the constraints that it faces today and in the past. Now, of course, 20-25 minutes is never sufficient to cover the historical gamut of the US role in South Asia. So let me focus on particular instances of history, particularly during the Cold War and after, which quite quintessentially, in my opinion, characterize America's relations with India in particular and South Asia in general. So what I'll do is look at India's relations and US relations with India and Pakistan, because these two sort of relations more or less define what kind of relations US broadly had with South Asia. Now, let me start with US-Pakistan relations. In many ways, sort of it defined the kind of relations US-India during the Cold War, because what the kind of relations that US-Pakistan had impinged directly or indirectly on its relations with India. So when Pakistan actually became independent, both US and Russia were leading countries to join their blocs. And as it happened in October 1947, just 2 months after Pakistan's independence, the United States established relations with Pakistan, making it amongst the first nations to establish bilateral relations with the new state. In this regard, an agreement took place between the two countries, which was in March 1959. This enabled military assistance to Pakistan, which continued, still continues today in some form, although it has been, the news has been tightened with the Obama administration's decisions, and now even more the Trump administration. But again, there are signs of the assistance getting back on track, although in limited forms. Now, this agreement, in many ways, sort of charted the path for the US-Pakistan relations, and in essence, shaped not so cordial relations with India during the Cold War. So you have to see this decision in the light of the administrations at that time in the US, and both Truman and Eisenhower administrations witnessed what I would say was a continuity in the containment strategy of the Soviet Union. And I think that really Pakistan was considered to be an important factor in that containment strategy. Now, Pakistan was useful to the US in many ways. It was a strategic space that would allow the US to contain the spread of communist Soviet Union in Central Asian states particularly. And later on, as you would see, it would have provided the US strategic grounds as well as resources for resisting the Soviets in the Afghanistan. Now, with that background, let me just move to US-India ties. Often it's been called, and famously by Dennis Cutz's work, an estranged relationship. Now, that is, of course, a thing of the past now, because now both the countries have come together in various forms, and there is a special status to US-India relations, which I'll come to later on. Significant partnership with Pakistan also meant that the United States wouldn't have great relations with the US, and this is because US was particularly not a hedging power. It was a great power, and its step during the Cold War. But insofar as concerned, I think in many ways the 1971 the year 1971 went on to become the hallmark of how the US-India relations were perceived. And for a long time in DC and Beltway circles,
Vivek, sorry to interrupt. There are some disturbances from your side. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Vivek?
Yeah, I can hear you. Is it not clear?
Vivek, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
There's some disturbances, I think, from your side.
Right, I thought I was clear. Is it fine now?
Now you can continue.
Okay.
Now it's fine.
Okay.
In between, there are some disturbances. So
right. I think fine, I think it's the internet, but let me continue. Yeah. So in many ways, of course, like I said, 1971 sort of went on to become the hallmark of how the US-India relations were perceived, and in DC and Beltway circles, for a long time, and even now in some circles, the understanding of the US in terms of US-India relations is that the Indian bureaucracy has had a historical baggage against better relations with the United States, particularly because of the 1971 incident. And the 1971, particularly when the incident that I'm pointing is the USS Enterprise of the Seventh Fleet coming all the way to the Bay of Bengal in order to deter India from the liberation war of Bangladesh. Now, if you see that in the context, of course, historically in the Cold War, you have the U.S.-China relations and the importance of the U.S.-China relations, which went in the 70s, in the 60s, and before that, it went in a lull for a long time until Nixon sort of visited in China and became a metaphor. Now, Pakistan, if you see that incidents of Nixon's visit to China, the preparations leading to his visit to China, Pakistan was really critical in terms of Kissinger coming there and making an overnight trip to China. Pakistan really played an important ground point in many ways. The 70s, the early 90s, the 71 was also was carrying the context of the 1971 Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty. That in many ways, to some extent, marked the clarity in side on which India was in terms of the two blocks. Although non-alignment continued, but the Friendship Treaty with the Soviet Union sort of tilted it in Soviet Union's favor. Also, if you look at some of the developments in terms of how the US perceived Indian leadership in the 70s and the Kennedy tapes and so on and so forth, doesn't augur well for India-US relations. So that clearly was the nature of relations during the Cold War. Some of the things that the Oval Tape reveals about in Indira Gandhi are really offensive in many ways. Now, that clearly shows some of the perceptions that the US had of India and its leadership. And there are various debates on why Indira Gandhi was perceived like that by the US. The people have argued on the lines of misogyny, geopolitics, also gender discourse. Here was a strong lady taking strong decisions, which particularly the US did not like. Now, India's own rise, if we move to the 90s and the opening up of the economy, India's own rise and coincided with some of the changing priorities of the US in South Asia. And I think that really set the tone for developing a different kind of relationship with the US. Now, if you look at some of the hallmarks of bilateral relations with the US in the post-Cold War era, of course, in the early 90s, in 1992, you have the Navy-to-Navy talks for the first time. There's a bit of an exchange there. I think that really set the tone in terms of it kept the governments apart, but still the military-to-military, the Navy-to-Navy coordination became a very good conduit to develop relations between the two sides. Moving on, I will not go into the details of each of the agreements that they've signed, but 2005, the framework for defense relations was critical, remains critical. It's signed for 10 years and then it's renewed. It was renewed yet again in 2015. Bush administration, as you all know, was critical in how the nuclear deal shaped up, and India became a signatory of the nuclear deal. The US also found some of Indian assistance in terms of the war on terror, at least if not physically, which was really, the US insisted that India had boots on ground, and the Vajpayee government was still under a lot of pressure, but they resisted it well, and they declined the offer to place boots on ground in West Asia, in Iraq. Now, there's certainly a moral support from the Indian side. If you look at the Obama-Trump administrations more recently, there have been, the US-India relations have tided over. There's a lot of developments, particularly in the area of defense. From Obama, you see a tightening of news around Pakistan's funding, growing pressure on terrorism after the 9/11 attacks, and India's designation of given a special status to India-US relations in terms of the major defense partner. That is what they call it. The three foundational agreements the US will sign. Two of them have already been signed, and the Logistic Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, the COMCASA, which is for Communications and Security Agreement, and the BECA, which is for Geospatial Intelligence, a Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement, which is the tenets of which are being finalized. And I think it will be really critical in terms of cooperating on a wide spectrum of defense or communication, security, surveillance, reconnaissance, and so forth. So these three agreements, the US, of course, signs with its allies and partners. India is not even a non-NATO ally. So the status of the major defense partner with the US, along with some of these foundational agreements that India signed and a very strong defense partnership, which sort of uplifts the whole bilateral relations to a new level, catapults India-US relations, in my opinion, between a friend and between a partner and an ally. I mean, that's a sweet spot for India to be there. Now, if you know the US if the US categorization of its allies and friends, there are three categorizations: friends, partners, and allies. So allies are the closest, and then partners, and then you have friends. I think India is closely between, and that would be, it's a hypothetical guess, but I would place India between an ally and a partner with some of these agreements that have been signed. Now, India is, of course, and if you look at the critical hallmarks of US-India relations leading up to the pandemic, I think India is one of the largest importers of defense equipment in the world, and US is among the top two countries that we import from. And Russia and the United States have sort of competed for the first two positions on and off, depending on which year we buy more from which country. This is, however, likely to sort of change with assertions on indigenous platform in the post-pandemic world, because most of the country is looking inward. It's not a great badge to wear to be the greatest, or the largest defense importer of the world, and so I think it'll be a welcome change if we start. And there is clear assertion from the government as well as from the three wings of the military that we need to sort of build a strong defense industrial base. The other aspect of a strong aspect of US-India relationship leading up to the pandemic is, of course, the Indo-Pacific Partnership. A lot has been changed a lot has been said in terms of how Indo-Pacific Partnership is really evolving. China has reacted to it from dismissing it to being secretly in concern about the Indo-Pacific. But it goes without saying that it's certainly, if not a strategy, it's certainly a partnership. And that partnership is backed by certain concrete decisions that impinges on US role in South Asia. First of which is, of course, the renaming of the US PACOM. Of course, many will say it's a nominal change. You've changed your US Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. How does it really make a difference in terms of ground operational capabilities? Now, it does make a difference in terms of, of course, it's a long-term assessment, but it does make a difference in terms of how you categorize and how you disseminate your points of focus in the area. In broad sense, the Indo-Pacific Command, the change of the name, basically starts with the institutionalization of the US role in South Asia, but the institutionalization of changing US role in South Asia. I think that is the topmost change that the US could have brought before it actually went ahead with some of the operational changes. So I think to that extent, a change at the level of a nominal level, which allows operational changes, has been done by changing the name. In terms of ground operations, I think what it has done is it has increased the bandwidth of the operations to include more partners, more democratic partners like India in the Asian strategic space. And that broadening of the strategic space is also a tacit acknowledgement by the United States that it cannot deal with China single-handedly today. And many of you might be thinking that United States is far ahead to China in terms of capabilities. It can really overwhelm China within a month or even less. That might be true, but you remember that you have to keep in mind that today's strategic game is what China calls winning without fighting a single bullet, right? You don't really have to engage in a war. That shows the smartness and that shows your capability. So you'll have to deal with a power like that in forms that suits the expansion that China is making. And I think to that extent, the Indo-Pacific strategy is really useful or will be useful going forward. Now, an assessment of US capabilities in South Asia in the context of a shift of power from the pivot to rebalance to now the Indo-Pacific has to be seen in the context of what China is doing. It is challenging. China is challenging the United States on almost every ground in South China Sea. That's regional, but also at the global level in terms of supply chains, in terms of being a manufacturing hub, and the US forcing the US to sort of some way, even though it might be because of the leadership, the kind of leadership that the US has, but it is compelled to look inwards more than outwards. And if you particularly see this in the context of the broader US role in Asia Pacific, in the 1950s, you had a series of agreements that the US signed with Japan, Australia, South Korea, and a host of other countries, at least half a dozen countries, that formed really the hub and spoke of the Asia Pacific alliance that we see today. Now, all of that seems to be under a lot of strain with the rise of China, and with these countries' growing dependence on China in terms of trade, where these countries who were clearly on the side of the US with some of these agreements are now saying that don't make us choose between the US and China, and that really speaks of the complexity that the Asia Pacific region is, and much of this has to do with why the Indo-Pacific has been churned. And it remains to be seen how this plays out. But I think the of the Asia Pacific are very important to understand how the Indo-Pacific is really evolving and why is it evolving. Now, if you look at the pandemic strategy of China, it has been supported by about 3 decades of continuous rise in terms of economy, in terms of military capability. The Navy, if you see, has produced more ships than any other Navy in the world, even the United States. And it's clearly in terms of number, they're much larger. And in terms of the production per year, they're much larger than the US. And gradually they're expanding beyond the Asia Pacific, moving on to parts of Indian Ocean region, to the Mediterranean Sea and to the Arctic. So it's not surprising. It's a series of steps taken by China on the back of decades of growth, uninterrupted growth. If you look at the pandemic strategy of China, there's sovereignty assertions everywhere. In South China Sea, Indonesia, Malaysia are facing the heat. Vietnam is facing the heat. On the border, India is in a standoff with China. And so sovereignty assertion is part of this pandemic strategy of China. And how do we deal with this? It has to be a collective strategy. It has, in my opinion, it has to be a collective strategy in the sense that China is too powerful or too complex to be dealt with a war or to be pushed back by deterrence. I think it has to be a collective strategy that handles China in all these assertions that it is making. Now, also part of, we've talked about the salami slicing and how it encroaches upon gradually the other country's sovereignty and makes it part of its own. But all part of the pandemic strategy of China. Now, this has necessitated that the US ropes in the Indo-Pacific, which gives it the comfortable, like I said, the comfortable bandwidth to restrain China's rise. But even within the Indo-Pacific, there's a lot of differences and there's a lot of disagreements. So vocal disagreements, but certainly implicit. Now, if you look at India's role, I think the much of the literature that has been generated around the Indo-Pacific and the Quad in the West, it's India for being the weakest link in the. But I think it has to be, of course, seen in the context of the national interest of India and what it wants from the Quad and the Quad. But during the pandemic, if you've seen, India has engaged furiously with not targeting China, but it has engaged furiously with the Quad and the Quad Plus mechanisms to evolve a strategy of pandemic response. And much of that goes, it's tacit that it's tacitly underlined with the fact that it comprises a strategy against China, or if not China directly, it certainly has. It is a strategy of its own. Now, but also a few years leading up to the pandemic, as a few years leading to the pandemic would have revealed, both US and China are at loggerheads, and much of that sort of comes out in parts of South Asia. At the global level, of course, they're fighting at the level of the United Nations, the WHO, and so forth. At the regional level, of course, South China Sea is the characteristic of that fight. Now, some of the recent decisions taken by the US are likely to impact its role in Asia, and those have to be looked at carefully, in my opinion. Now, if you look at the troop pullout decision of the US from Afghanistan, also many will in the context of the upcoming elections in the United States. Now, but it will certainly impact how China and India play their roles in Afghanistan. There's a lot been, Trump has said publicly that India should put boots on the ground. There's no use making libraries in Afghanistan and so forth. Although India will certainly, in my opinion, not do so and shouldn't do so. But China will certainly scramble very rapidly to fill in the Afghanistan gap. And there are India and China are also ironically working together in Afghanistan, training each other, training Afghan forces, and so forth. But it creates a power void that, in my opinion, will be filled by China, if not by physical troops. I think certainly by a lot of money that will be pumped in by China in terms of development as we go forward. In terms of weakening Asia-Pacific alliance system, which I talked about, the hub and the spokes that has connected the Asia-Pacific. I think the US administration owes a lot in terms of how it has reacted to the alliance system and the weakening of it. It has been responsible for its own weakening. The Trump administration, particularly with its emphasis on troop reduction everywhere, and asking its allies like Japan and South Korea to pay for the troops that it has stationed there. I think it clearly defies the grounds and some of the tenets of agreements that they signed in the 1950s. And I think that's not a good thing for the whole alliance system that Asia Pacific has. The third is that relations with Asia isn't going the way the US wants it to go. For instance, I pointed the Quad out. Right? The US doesn't want the Quad to move in the manner it is moving right now. I mean, the US at least wants that the Quad has a strategic purpose. Well, for India, it probably is the same, and therefore the piece of Quad and the nature of Quad in terms of response and strategy is not exactly coinciding with the US in terms of what India wants. Now, recently, Trump also announced that it'll withdraw troops from Germany. right? In Stuttgart, Germany, if you know, it's also the base for the US European Command. That clearly is again a blow to the transatlantic ties that the United States has with the European Union and Europe. What will it lead in terms of its impact on Russia's role in European Union, particularly Eastern Europe, and China's role in European Union is likely is very difficult to say from now. If really US decides to pull out from Germany, withdrawal from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course, all of us know that it has created a huge gap, but which has been, I mean, there have been mechanisms which have been proposed to fill in that gap. It remains to be seen how that plays out. Withdrawal from the WHO, I think that was a very important decision by the US, which will have significant impacts or impact on what role does it really on the global role of the US, and that will certainly impact some of the developments in Asia. You saw that immediately after the Trump administration announced the withdrawal, China promised a 30 billion money, a 30 billion amount to the WHO. Obviously, it's much less to compare in comparison to what the US gives to WHO, which is way more, which is 10 times more, or even. But you know, China is signaling that if the voids are created, it will not sit back and watch it. It will just swoop in and fill the gap. So broadly, I would say that the US is what the Americans call AWOL, you know, absent without leave from the international system. And that impinges on its role in South Asia as much as it impinges anywhere else. Now, in South Asia, of course, you've seen that in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think it'll be critical on how the Indo-Pacific strategy evolves to the evolving role of US in South Asia. The US has announced the Blue Dot Network will facilitate private networks to come in and give loans to countries on the lines of the BRI, but it remains to be seen if it can muster that kind of capital, and also whether it really goes on to be, I mean, how many countries are part of it and really goes on to be a fruitful exercise. Now, these decisions will, of course, give ample leg room to China in terms of the decisions on where the US hasn't really come in, will give ample leg room to China in terms of filling the power vacuum. Now, if the US-China relations in South Asia is also caught in this alliance partner and friend dilemma, right? I mean, some of us might think that China is clear on pressurizing India on issues of terrorism, like Masood Azhar. It was clear in pointing in supporting Pakistan on issues of sovereignty. You look at China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. China is a part of it, and it's not flinching. That we should go on and make even stronger partnership, perhaps an alliance with the United States. But remember that such decisions will be irreversible and will forever change the course of foreign policy. And it might not be entirely in the interest of India. Therefore, the caution. Some of that caution at the border that you're seeing is part of this mulling that Indian strategic thinkers and policymakers do. Now, in my opinion, in terms of the India-China-US dynamics, I don't see India with the same kind of bandwidth that it had, let's say 10 years back, to decide on strategic autonomy. I think that the road to strategic autonomy is sort of getting narrower in terms of because there you have a precedent in the US which is very clear of what it wants and is very reciprocal. If you do not give the United States the things that it might make your roads narrower. With China, it's not getting any easier for India. It's tougher. So I think the days ahead will be very polarizing in that sense. And some of that you're already signs of which you're already seeing in India's strategic behavior in terms of talking to the United States about the China issue, which was very rare. You also have a president in the US which has reached out and that they want to he wants to mediate. That's a different issue, but you you but these are basically the signs of change in Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis China and the US. Now, let me come to the the Nepal border conflict and the Trump administration basically offering to mediate. Now, the US, I think, will think twice before wading into a territorial conflict in South Asia. But with the kind of presidency that you have, it's unpredictable. And therefore, you had a president which clearly said that he wants to mediate between China and the US. And Trump's offer to mediate, of course, is guided both by geopolitics and his own desire to, what many say, to win a Nobel Prize for mediation, as Obama did for Israel-Palestine. But who knows? That remains undecided. But there are clear signs that the US administration is watching this standoff very clearly. And therefore, and there are also talks going. I mean, Prime Minister Modi certainly talked with the Trump administration on the China issue. Alice Wells, just days before retiring, who was in the Department of State on the South Central desk, she clearly said that this is China. She clearly basically intervened in the issue and gave a certain statement that China was being a territorial hegemon. And so forth, which is rare. The conflict is on in compared to how the US has reacted vis-a-vis China-India border conflict in the past. Now, I'll take another 5 minutes and wrap it up, and probably open it up for Q&A. Recent decisions by the US impacting South Asia, also targeting China, and what does it mean in particular for China, in particular for India and China in general? I think the tightening news on Pakistan, as I said, will be hard to reverse. There will be some assistance to Pakistan still flowing, but I think in the coming days and with the coming election, much will depend on what happens in the election with Joe Biden really gaining grounds in the US. If the Democratic Party comes in, you might see a certain resumption of the aid to Pakistan. But it will be difficult in terms of how its relations with India are progressing and the pressure from India and so forth. Depleting stake in Afghanistan, I think, would mean lesser role for Pakistan in the US strategic game in Asia. And it would really take a global catastrophe to bring back the kind of role that the US had in Afghanistan. And with the Taliban gaining grounds in the government, I think it will be very difficult for the US to come back, and that would mean lessen strategic space and with Central Asia and West Asia. And so again, I will say that much will depend on how the Indo-Pacific unravels itself, right? Then there is changing multilateralism. There is clearly the US Trump decision to sort of make a D10, a group of 10 countries democratically united. How that shapes up remains to be seen, but I think it sort of, it dilutes the importance of G7. The second question for me is, what kind of role will Russia be roped in, and what kind of role will Russia really play in D10, right? Because Russia, you remember, was thrown out because of the Crimea and annexation and so forth. That hasn't been reversed. So I wonder what role would Russia really play here. In terms of pulling out of WHO, India's lead role at the WHO, as you would have seen, Dr. Harshvardhan taking over the head of the WHO, which monitors the WHO. India also has gained a non-permanent seat at the UN. Will that and US has sort of virtually pulled out of the WHO. So that really means for India that the pressure in terms of decision making at the UN, at the WHO against China has or will be lessened. Was US still an active component of the WHO? the pressure on India would have been much. But who knows what goes behind the curtains. So these contrasting features, I think, creates a dilemma for foreign policy at the global level for India in terms of US-India dynamics. Now, finally, is there a middle power coalition, and what does that mean for US-India ties? You have seen a host of countries led by Australia to ask for an open investigation against China, and then you have a band of countries coming together like Japan, Germany, and India for a new role. And there's a host of literature around the middle power coalition role and what it really means. Even as great powers sort of contract and look inwards, US is certainly looking inwards. China is, of course, growing, and that represents the contrasting block in terms of then you would have a group of middle power coalition against China. Not basically fighting, but managing China in terms, because the US has certainly given away hopes in that sense. So what constrains the achievements of US-India ties? As we go forward, defense relations will certainly remain very critical. But if administration returns, I think primarily because their focus is much on the elections, India has been left off the hook in terms of pressure, in terms of being pressurized in the Quad mechanism and so forth, to take a definitive stand. Now, if Trump returns, I think we will see perhaps a more focused pressure on India to take, if not overtly, covertly, a stand in terms of it, making it stand clear on where it stands vis-a-vis China and some of the global issues, if not regional, certainly global. I think I'll stop there and open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, Vivek. Such a wonderful presentation, covering so many points. So I request, we already got a couple of questions, and those who are interested, kindly type your questions in the chat box. And I'd like to open the floor for Q&A with my question for the first. So even if you see lots of debate, lots of articles, and lot of are coming about the post-pandemic, that there may be possibility of emergence of a new Cold War between China and United States because of that. So do you see if it is a possibility, and if South Asia or maybe what we call the Indo-Pacific could be a theater for that power struggle between these two superpowers? Do you agree on that articles? Lots of articles and videos coming about.
Yeah, see, we've seen a lot of literature on the new Cold War. I think a lot of constituents of the Cold War and the current scenario differ. I think in the Cold War you had Soviet Union, which was the economy of Soviet Union for one. The economy of Soviet Union and China is vastly different. Soviet Union didn't have this kind of economy. China's power in terms of its expanse and in terms of the complexity of how it really goes forward is critical, and it's way different than how Soviet Union actually went ahead. So I think there is a clear difference in terms of comparing Cold War to this. I think we will have to invent or give a new name to this confrontation, because this will, in my opinion, two countries like China and the US will not go as far as the Cuban Missile Crisis to position their nuclear arsenal against each other. I think a lot of this war involves a lot of secretive components against each other. A lot of strategy, which Cold War was completely not having. So we will see a lot of technology employment, a lot of cyber security related threats, which we already have seen. So there will not be a direct confrontation to that extent. I think it's closer to, I think it's comparable to the Cold War. But in terms of its real constituents, I think it's vastly different from the Cold War. I think I would position there.
So I'll now go with the questions. So the first question is from my colleague Dr. Viraj Bhargava. So how far US and India's growing relationship is actually affecting the position of China in world affairs? So this is the first question. So I think we should go one by one. Okay?
Can you repeat that question again?
Sure, I'll repeat again. How far US and India's growing relationship is actually affecting the position of China in world affairs?
Right. So it certainly affects. I mean, China might show that it doesn't affect that U.S.-India relations and the Indo-Pacific strategy. They dismissed the whole Indo-Pacific strategy as a quote-unquote froth on the water which will disperse. Now, it's not really that simple. For China, if it's not a nightmare, it's certainly a concern that India-U.S. are talking and are becoming close. And if you talk to China watchers, I think one of the reasons why India has been pushed towards embracing the United States is China. Right? Had China not acted the way it has, India had little reason to sort of strategically embrace the United States and maybe have a relations with the United States at the business level or at the trade level, right? But much of what China has done sort of has impacted how India has developed its relations with the US, and I think it's vice versa in terms of its impact. So if the US and India really collaborate in the Indo-Pacific and have come out with a Blue Dot network, it certainly will impinge on how the BRI allows the Belt and Road Initiative allows countries to take loans from countries, and US India ties and countries like US and India swoop in, and then they create alternatives for these countries, because then some of the problems that have cropped up in the BRI, like debt, the predatory debts. US has made it very clear that that's not a part of the BRI. If you aren't able to pay back the loan, we will not take a piece of your land, like it happened in Sri Lanka and other places, in Kenya, for instance. So I think it certainly is affecting already how China sees it. But on the surface of it, China certainly denies, and it says that it doesn't affect.
I'll move to the next two questions, which are almost same. So I'm combining. How far do you consider US as a reliable ally of India in countering China? And next one, what kind of policies can India should take to maintain its strategic autonomy while cooperating with the United States? I think both are interrelated.
I think both are interrelated. Thank you for the question. I think in terms of what was the first question? I just lost the track of it.
Is the United States a reliable ally?
Yeah. So in terms of reliability, I think for a long time, realists would throw this sentence, and I think it stands true in many ways in terms of India-US or any other relations. What really matters in IR in terms of realpolitik is interests, right? If your interests combine and if your interests converge, then the two countries come together. But in terms of reliability, you can't trust the United States or any other country with your life and with your decisions that impinge on your national security. So, for instance, and that is the primary reason all countries, and particularly India, which has followed the strategic autonomy continues to follow strategic autonomy, takes the United States with a pinch of salt. And I think that's very critical going forward. Like I said, in the US too, India is taken with a pinch of salt in terms of the bureaucratic baggage. And much of that is dissipating, but still continues in some form. I think that is on both sides. I mean, both sides, because we haven't been the best of friends in the Cold War. But you have to remember that it's a relationship which is more so during the Trump administration hinged on trade. If India today stops buying completely from the US, you would see a different Trump administration tomorrow, a completely different Trump administration tomorrow. So none of the countries should actually put all their eggs in one basket and completely trust the United States with something. You can take that assistance, but in terms of and how India can maintain its strategic autonomy, I think we already are. What we are doing in terms of foreign policy is a story which tells itself on how we should preserve our strategic autonomy. I think the fact that we haven't really gone forward and signed all the agreements in the manner that the United States wants. For instance, if you look at the three foundational agreements, and particularly the two that we've signed, the Limoa Logistic Exchange Memorandum of Agreement and Kumkaza, I think the United States, if you go into the details of it, the United States has signed same agreements with its allies, but of a different form. They're called by different names. The reason why they're called by different names in case of India is because we did not agree with a few intrusive terms and tenets of the agreements, and that I think that is one example where strategic autonomy is reflected, and how we can preserve it. I think we are asserting ourselves enough with the US, and we are not. You're not an ancillary partner to the US. I think that's how you can really preserve best the strategic autonomy.
Okay. Okay, I'll move to the next question, which is from Dr. Untitled Chapter from Department of History, RGU. So, how do you visualize the future of BRI in a post-COVID world and the US-China competitions in this context? I'll repeat again. How do you visualize the future of BRI and the US-China competition in this context?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think the future of BRI, for one, in the post-pandemic era, will be one of pressure. The European Union, if not totally, are already showing signs of constriction in terms of how much they are willing to engage with the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Many analysts have pointed precisely the Belt and Road Initiative for the kind of spread that Europe saw, right? The connectivity that China today has with European Union became a bane in terms of the spread of the disease. To that extent, you will see a European Union led by, in my opinion, the UK, which is going hammer and tongs at China in terms of lessening its dependence on China, and that will be ranging from a host of issues, from Huawei 5G technology. You're already seeing some of the countries saying that we will not go ahead with the 5G technologies of China. You will also see a lot of curtailment in terms of dependence on China, in terms of taking loan from China. But that rides with the caveat that some of the smaller countries, particularly in the Eastern Europe, may not be in a position to let go of the money of China, right? They are small countries. They don't have the GDP or the kind of money to sustain their economy, and they might still want or be compelled to take money from China. So there's going to be a mix in terms of Belt and Road Initiative. It is already facing the pressure, but insofar as the CCP is concerned, the Chinese Communist Party, I think from the literature that has come out, they will increase the ability to finance more in terms of Belt and Road Initiative. Whether the countries in Europe and other places, smaller countries like in the South Pacific, will take these money remains to be seen. But given the fact that most of the countries and their economies are in doldrums, it's very hard to predict. So there will be pressure from China. There will be increased funding in terms of BRI from China. But the absorption of that money remains to be seen, and how it goes forward.
Okay, shall I move to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay, so next question is from our MA student from 4th semester, Projayita Kashyap. Her question is a little long, so just hear carefully. I wanted to request for your opinion on the hypothetical possibility of China relying on the support of South Asian nations, including India, in the quest to overthrow the least equal up to the United States in the global political positions and hegemony. So in this scenario, can India and China overlook their historical differences? If It's quite a long question, I hope.
But I got the
basically,
yeah.
basically hypothetical positions, India and China cooperating to get rid of US hegemony.
It's, given the current scenario, it's really difficult. But I would say that there are already characteristics of India-China cooperating not against the US, but to solve their own interests. And I think that is going to continue. Whether India and the US will come together to form the Asian solidarity as Nehru envisioned is very hard to imagine, unless we solve the border dispute with China, and that looks very unlikely in the next many years. So unless and until we have a running dispute with China, I don't think we will be able, or even if we do, I think the manner in which the world has globalized, it'll be difficult to, and given the historicity of India-China ties, I think it'll be difficult to position India-China in one basket against the United States. They might come together for their own interests, but that might not be entirely directed against the United States. I don't see any reason, unless India is directly threatened, even then, counting China will be very difficult. In terms of, I think I missed out. Yeah, I missed out the US-China component of the BRI, the last question. But
actually, Vivek, the next question is similar, so maybe you can answer together. So next question is from Mr. Subham Dey from Calcutta University, Department of Southeast Asia. Do you see any US interference if India steps toward annexing POK, Aksai Chin, Kalapani, Lupik through dialogue, vis-a-vis China, CPAC, and BRI, basically? So US interference regarding this kind of developments. And so
that, again, there is a lot of literature, and also there's a lot of opinion being generated around the fact that India, and this certainly in Pakistan, if you see their strategic space, that India might be preparing for an overhaul and eventual take of the POK. We've given some signals. I mean, it has been enunciated in the parliament, and the reflection now of the temperature and the weather of Muzaffarabad and other places in India is clearly giving sleepless nights to Pakistan. But if and when India decides, and that's a big if, decides to take certain parts of like certain parts that it claims, it is still difficult for the United States to support India directly. One, of course, is historically it's difficult for one is, of course, it's receding from the global power role. Second is that if you look at the South Asian, and I've referred to it in my talks, if you look at the historicity of border disputes and sovereignty claims in South Asia, the US has hardly intervened and because that is primarily because of the reason that South Asian countries themselves don't want a direct intervention of the US. If you go back to 1970s, you come across the Zone of Peace declaration by Sri Lanka in the UN, which clearly states that they wanted Indian Ocean, they wanted great powers out of Indian Ocean. So by their very mentality and by the very nature of their foreign policy, foreign power intervention between two countries or a host of countries in South Asia is not really entertained by most countries here. So it'll be difficult to see US directly intervene, but a tacit support in terms of technology, in terms of surveillance, in terms of information, certainly yes. I certainly see that.
So next question is from Mayuri Dey. How do Indo-US maritime relations define the Indian Ocean regional structure as a cooperation between great power and rising power, and define India's power status? I'll repeat again. How do Indo-US maritime relations define the Indian Ocean's regional structure as a cooperation between great power and rising power, and define India's power status?
Yeah, thank you, Mayuri, for that question. If you look at the Indian Ocean, one of the primary reasons why it's now the Indo-Pacific, and that's really caught the steam, is because there is behind there is a strategy behind this thinking. There is a strategy that envisions the Indo-Pacific as a security architecture, and that will necessarily require a rising power like India to cooperate with a great power uh, like the United States. But with receding roles, I mean, if you look at the South Asian maritime expanse, the US is again AWOL, absent without leave. I mean, except for Diego Garcia, the United States and Gulf, where the fifth in Bahrain, the United States is largely missing from this space, and therefore you have seen that while this Indo-Pacific strategy is certainly taking shape in some form or the other, but it's a coalition. It's not just the US and India, and certainly countries like France, countries like Germany, countries like Japan. You will also require these countries to come together to form a stable and a promising security architecture that you are really envisioning in this area. Right, the United States certainly is a key player. Remains to cooperate in this area. In terms of information, in terms of reconnaissance, there's a lot that is happening between India and the US. So information sharing, particularly on submarines, etc. And Commodore Anil Jaising will know better of this. But there's a lot happening in terms of information sharing and all of that in this vast space. So a rising power like India's, and if you look at history, rising powers often latch on to major powers. They've never become major powers on their own, and I think that really is playing out in this vast space. But again, what China does is in this region will go on to define the extent of embrace of India, of not just the United States but even other countries in terms of specific and focused decision making.
So next question is from Commander Anil Jaising. First of all, I'd like to thank you, sir, for sparing your time and attending this seminar. So I'm going to convey this question. Is China sensing a vulnerability in India's current economic and military state in view of COVID-19 and conveying a not so subtle message to India to not interfere on anyone's behalf in China's maritime aspiration in the SCS? Shall I repeat again?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Is China sensing a vulnerability in India's current economic and military state in view of COVID and conveying a not so subtle message to India to not interfere on anyone's behalf in China's maritime aspiration in the SCS?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Commodore. I think, in my opinion, China is certainly sensing a sense of vulnerability. But along with that, I think its own vulnerabilities are coming out, because you're seeing a power that is scrambling to pressure different countries and different points at the same time, while it has claimed to contain the COVID-19. And I think I was coming across a study in China which already projected India's COVID rise. So they do have a sense of how COVID is, at least a remote sense of how COVID is going to unravel, and the numbers don't show a very good pattern in India. So they have certainly calculated, in my opinion, the vulnerabilities of India. And it is also, the border standoff, for instance, is, I compare it in my analysis with the acupuncture, with acupuncture. They have certainly to bring home certain points, they pressurize certain points that are elsewhere. And so border standoff is a pressurizing point for various messaging. For example, the India shouldn't venture out into South China Sea, as it looks more likely, because you see, India has already signed the Vladivostok Chennai agreement. So that route through the Strait of Malacca across to Vladivostok is going to, in a few years, if be functional. that would mean increasing stakes for India in the South China Sea. Vietnam, of course, is always welcoming for India, and India in the past has gone there, been pressurized to come back. In terms of the and of course the Malabar exercises, now Australia, I'm told, is only days or months away from being declared a partner in the Malabar exercises. What that would translate into is basically increasing states on the eastern side of Strait of Malacca for India. And that is certainly not a good sign for China. And I think China can foresee this, and therefore various pressurizing tactics and strategies against India are being adopted to that end. So I would kind of agree with you, Commodore. Yeah.
Okay, so there are last two questions I will convey to you. Then I think we can wind up the session. So the second last question is from Ahmad Ali Ahmed. He's asking why Russia is silent on India-China Ladakh border tension on these days, although India is also the largest military equipment buyer from Russia. And the last question is from someone from MIT University, Noida. I didn't get that name. Do you think US will still be the superpower in the post-COVID-19 world? I think that is the perfect question to wind it up. So please respond the first one, then we can wind up with the last question.
Yeah. To the question on why Russia is silent on Indo-China Ladakh border tension, if you've seen Russian strategic behavior for the past few years, it has dramatically changed. And that is also because India's own behavior has changed. As India has gotten closer to the United States, Russia, even though, and it's a complex interdependence. And therefore, while you would see two countries tied very healthily with defense and with trade, you would still see differences on various issues, right? So this is a sign of the same scale. Now, if you see Russia, it is we are importing from Russia the defense equipment, and we've been partners of Russia for a very long time, strong partners with Russia for a very long time. Now, it has developed close relations with Pakistan, and even after back channel pressures on Russia not to conduct a military exercises a couple of years back in the disputed Gilgit-Baltistan, they went ahead and conducted it. Right. So strategic behaviors of state is not pinpointed or focused on one issue. And these actually, if you keep the engagement on and still play at the country's vulnerabilities, then I think it gives you a wider spectrum to maneuver. And I think that is exactly what India's strategic autonomy allows it. And Russia now is entering that phase. As it's seeing India getting closer to the US, and Russia has spread its relations much more between India and China, and therefore it doesn't want to be put in a corner in terms of decision making and say because China and India are having a border conflict, we will not engage with China because we are partners with India. It doesn't happen like that anymore. And this is because the spectrum of strategic autonomy has widened. This is strategic hedging, which most countries are indulging in. And I think Russia is smartly doing that. To the second question on whether I think US will still be the superpower, I'm wondering what are the components that you're looking at. If you look at hard power capabilities, of course, China will take years before it catches up in terms of military strength with the US. But in terms of investment, in terms of money, in terms of trade, I think China will really take over the US because the expanse of the BRI, if you look at it, it has engaged so many countries on so many fronts that the churning of the money and the churning of the trade will still happen despite they're not bound to stop immediately because of the COVID-19 or any other issue. So in that sense, US will not, it'll be a compelling and a power to reckon with in many instances in terms of hard power. But how it really plays out will depend on the leadership. In my opinion, the statesmanship of the United States right now is completely missing. You don't have leaders who signed, for instance, who signed the Atlantic Charter in 1941. You have leaders like Trump, who's looking inwards and who, speaks off the hand, and foreign policies are made on Twitter. So you don't have that statesmanship that brings thoughtful analysis and that brings careful thought in foreign policy. So I wouldn't see a global role for the United States given its foreign policy, and I think that has created substantial space for China to sort of swoop in. Thank you.
So that question was from Ankur Kashyap, Amity Institute. We got another question, but you have already addressed that, balance of power. So on behalf of, again, Department of Political Science and Public Administrations, I'd like to thank you, all of you, for this wonderful program. A special thanks to Vivek and such an excellent and engaging Q&A. I can see some of our senior teachers who participated, Durga ma'am, Vaishali ma'am, Jasmine ma'am, Ninu ma'am. I'm very sorry if I left out someone, but this is really wonderful experience. And at last, I'd like to thank our VC sir, academic chairman sir, register ma'am, and the last not the least, our technical support team for making this event such a successful. I saw participants from all over India, which is, I think, a really success. And Vivek, we hope to engage you in our future endeavor. And thank you, all of you. Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Costa.
Thank you, all of you. You can leave the meeting.